presenting history's best on PBS.
This documentary series has been made possible by grants from the following: the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and the annual financial support from viewers like you, the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, and the Meadows Foundation. Additional support has been provided by the Arthur Vining Davis Foundations, the Summerlee Foundation, and the following organizations and individuals.
For Mexico, 1846 had been a year of bitter defeat. U.S. General Zachary Taylor's forces had routed the Mexican army in Texas and crossed the Rio Grande. There were other losses. U.S. President James K. Polk had sent Stephen Kearny's Army of the West to occupy New Mexico. Within months, California would fall too. But for Mexico, 1846 would also be the year of the return of exiled President Antonio López de Santana. Soon, Santana would meet Zachary Taylor on a barren, windswept plateau in the Battle of Buena Vista. And Polk would open a second front, invading Mexico by sea. If necessary, he would strike the very heart of the country, Mexico City itself, the fabled halls of Montezuma. In August of 1846, a ship from Havana, Cuba, carved its way through the waters of the Gulf of Mexico, bound for Veracruz. On board was a man who was convinced that he would be the savior of his country. He was the exiled former president of Mexico, Antonio López de Santana. The Mexican government of Mariano Paredes had just fallen, and Santa Anna's supporters were clamoring for his return.
Necesitamos un general.
We need a general who would be able to organize an army without money, who has enough, let's say it in whatever way, charisma to attract soldiers and get them to fight without pay, without training, without anything, and who is able to unite certain groups.
Earlier that year, Santana had sent a confidential agent to U.S. President James K. Polk with a surprising proposal. If Polk would allow him to pass through the U.S. blockade of Mexico, Santa Anna would try to bring about the sale of California to the United States. The terms of the offer were vague, and Santa Anna was still hated in the United States by those who remembered the Alamo and Goliad. But in spite of his doubts, Polk agreed to the proposal.
When you face Santa Anna with Polk, you're facing one opportunist with another. They both have that characteristic as a part of their makeup. And if Santa Anna was returning to Mexico without any clear idea of what he was going to do, Polk was using Santa Anna deliberately to gain something that he had not been able to gain any other way, that is, negotiations with Mexico. Of course, what he did not foresee was that Santa Anna would rally his people. This was the danger, but Polk didn't realize what a danger it was.
Now, after a year and a half in exile, Santana was returning home. On Polk's orders, the U.S. Navy allowed him to pass through the blockade. In Veracruz, Santana greeted the small crowd that had gathered to welcome him home.
Mexicanos, there was once a day you called me the soldier of the people. Allow me to assume that title again and to devote myself until death to the defense of liberty and to the independence of the Republic.
The homecoming was uneasy. Not 2 years earlier, Santa Anna's abuse of presidential power had caused an angry mob to smash his statue, exhume the leg he had lost to war, and drag it through the streets of Mexico City. Now, there were already rumors that Santa Anna might have made a deal with Polk.
La gente no sabe si es cierto.
The people don't know if it is true, but the politicians don't have confidence in Santa Anna. And this is another vulnerable point for Mexico, because the politicians aren't going to trust the general and commander of the Mexican army. A serious thing in a state of war.
Even so, Santa Anna had become the only leader who could unite the country and stop the U.S. invasion. In December of 1846, just 3 months after his return from exile, he was elected President of Mexico again. In the entire United States Army, one man stood out as the general most able to win the war with Mexico. President Polk disliked him with a passion. His name was Winfield Scott. He was the Army's general-in-chief. A hero of the War of 1812 and a superior strategist, Scott had twice gone abroad to study European military tactics. Some found him brilliant and entertaining, yet he struck others as impossibly pompous and vain. Ulysses Grant once remarked that the general always wore all the uniform allowed by law.
Technically, he was far more accomplished soldier than Taylor had been. But in contrast to the nickname of Old Rough and Ready or Old Zach for Taylor, Scott was unfortunately known as Old Fuss and Feathers because he loved military panoply. And he loved uniforms, he loved to have his staff with him, and oh gosh. So therefore, when he got in trouble, people just enjoyed his discomfort.
By the fall of 1846, Polk was convinced he had to open a second front against Mexico. He needed a commander. Polk despised Scott personally and feared him politically. Scott was a member of the opposing Whig Party. For as long as he could, Polk had kept Scott behind a desk in Washington. But now the president needed the general's talent as a soldier. Reluctantly, Polk gave Scott command of the operation.
He was so grateful and so much affected that he almost shed tears. He left apparently the most delighted man I have seen for a long time, James K. Polk.
From the beginning, Winfield Scott had argued that only a major campaign against Mexico City itself would force the Mexicans to surrender. He would do it the way Cortez had defeated the Aztecs: land an army on the coast at Veracruz and fight his way 250 miles up the National Highway and into the capital. Scott knew he had to move quickly. Veracruz was known to suffer devastating epidemics of malaria and yellow fever in late spring. An invading army would have to capture Veracruz and move to higher ground before then. The general needed troops immediately. The most available and most experienced were Zachary Taylor's soldiers in northern Mexico. Taylor had established his headquarters in the provincial capital of Saltillo, 75 miles southwest of Monterrey. In January of 1847, he received a letter from Scott.
My dear General, I shall be obliged to take from you most of the gallant officers and men whom you have so long and nobly commanded. General Winfield Scott.
Taylor was so upset, an aide saw him mistakenly spoon mustard into his coffee.
Such a decimation of my army had never crossed my mind. The idea of a further advance with the remaining forces is too preposterous to be entertained for a moment. General Zachary Taylor.
Even at full strength, Taylor's army had always been outnumbered. Now, with his troops reduced to 5,000 inexperienced volunteers, the general knew he was dangerously exposed. What he did not know was that Santana was aware of it too. By this time, in January of 1847, Santana was in San Luis Potosí, north of Mexico City, where he had managed to raise an army of 20,000 soldiers. Bystanders watched as officers hastily organized recruits so inexperienced, many had never held a gun. The troops were not ready, but Santa Anna felt he had to take the field. He was still the target of suspicious rumors concerning his deal with Polk. Critics were questioning why he had not yet fought the invaders. The general had learned from captured documents of Scott's planned invasion at Veracruz. Now he faced a crucial decision. The landing at Veracruz would have to be stopped, but a quick victory first over Taylor's weakened forces would silence those who still questioned his leadership. To march north in the middle of winter was a gamble, but Santana was willing to accept the risk. Now was the time to meet Taylor's army and destroy it.
Saltillo lies on the slope of a hill. The cathedral occupies one side. Its 15 bells chime sweetly. After a hard and dusty march, we entered with music and colors flying. The Mexicans looked daggers, and doubtless had them, but did not dare to draw them. Lieutenant John James Peck.
When the North Americans arrived in Saltillo at the end of 1846, the citizens received them coldly. They all closed their doors and put black ribbons or bows of mourning on them in honor of the Mexican soldiers who had died at Monterrey, and the soldiers entered and occupied the center of the city.
During the U.S. occupation of Saltillo, soldiers and civilians became more accustomed to one another. And Lieutenant John Peck found time to appreciate his surroundings.
The ladies of Saltillo are pretty, have elegant forms and move with that ease and grace so peculiar to the Castilians. Oftentimes, they strike the light guitar. In going to my meals, I pass some beautiful creatures. All I can say is, buenos dias and buenos tardes.
No less romantic, but considerably more daring, was a volunteer from Boston, Private Sam Chamberlain. As a boy, Chamberlain had intended to study theology, but instead became a self-described rogue who loved fighting and women in equal measure. He was a self-taught artist, and in his later years wrote a lavishly illustrated account of his adventures during the war. According to what he called his confession, Chamberlain never missed a Mexican fandango, never fought a man he didn't beat, and rarely met a woman who could resist his charm. But Chamberlain was also a keen observer, and in his recollections, he described horrifying incidents of wartime violence. Amid the settled routine of occupation life, death would come suddenly, without warning. Mexican guerrilla fighters would sweep down on U.S. supply trains or pick off individual soldiers, leaving the dead mutilated beyond recognition. Mexican civilians found themselves caught between both sides.
Many of the people living in the small towns, ranches, haciendas, and farms suffered attacks by the Mexican guerrilla fighters because they thought the people were aiding the North American army. And at times, the North Americans attacked them, burned and destroyed their buildings, because they thought the people were helping the guerrilla forces. It was a situation the civilians could not win.
As the occupation wore on, Taylor found it hard to keep discipline in the ranks. Chamberlain wrote that the most abusive and violent soldiers were the volunteers from the southern states.
Looking upon the greasers as belonging to the same social class as their own Negro slaves, they plundered and ill-treated them. We were obliged to patrol the country for miles around camp to protect the wretched inhabitants and arrest these heroes.
On one of the occasions when Mexican civilians fought back and killed a U.S. soldier, the volunteers from Arkansas, known as Rackensackers, sought revenge. Sam Chamberlain was on patrol when he heard gunfire in the hills.
Cries of women and children reached our ears, coming from a cave at the end of the ravine. A horrid sight was before us. The cave was full of our volunteers yelling like fiends, while on the rocky floor lay over 20 Mexicans, dead and dying in pools of blood.
Taylor was outraged by the massacre and ordered the Rackensackers to return home in disgrace. But before they could leave, U.S. scouts reported a large Mexican army approaching from the south. It was Santa Anna, and Taylor would need every man he had. It was mid-February of 1847. For 3 weeks, Santa Anna and his army had suffered an agonizing journey north through the desolate countryside. Second Lieutenant Manuel Balbantin had survived the Battle of Monterrey. Now he feared he would freeze to death.
It's bitter cold, windy and snowing. Last night some of the soldiers and the women died. The troops, hungry and numb from the cold, refused to march.
Illness, desertion, and death had taken a terrible toll. Of the 20,000 who had started the march, only 15,000 remained. Traveling with the soldiers were an unknown number of women who had chosen to march with the army and care for their men.
These women travel on foot, carrying babies on their backs, carrying small grills for cooking, accompanying the soldiers. And many times they also die. They die of hunger, they die of sickness, they die of abandonment.
Still, Santa Anna pushed his troops relentlessly north, hoping to surprise Taylor's army at Agua Nueva, south of Saltillo. But the U.S. general was waiting for him. At a place where the road to Saltillo ran through a narrow pass the Mexicans called La Angostura. The U.S. soldiers called it Buena Vista, after a nearby hacienda. The position was well chosen. The plateau was deeply furrowed, surrounded by hills and gullies. The broken ground would hamper Santa Anna's best troops, the cavalry. The hills would be almost impossible to take.
So it was defensible. If you could hold those heights, and it's easy to hold down by the gulches, you could defend yourself against a much larger force, which is exactly what Taylor did on the very strong advice of John E. Wool, who was a very, very excellent soldier.
That night, a terrible winter storm blew over the troops, blasting overhead with thunder and lightning. Both sides lay on their weapons, without fires, shiver in the icy wind. The next day dawned clear and cold. Taylor's troops could see that they were outnumbered 3-1. Most of them were volunteers who had never seen battle. Reveille sounded along the Mexican lines. Private Sam Chamberlain watched in awe as the call passed from unit to unit.
A procession of ecclesiastical dignitaries, with all the gorgeous paraphernalia of the Catholic Church, advanced along the lines, preceded by the bands playing a solemn anthem. Their cavalry was magnificent. Some 6,000 in uniforms of blue, faced with red, with waving plumes and glittering weapons, advanced toward us as if they would ride down our little band and finish the battle in one blow. Private Sam Chamberlain.
Early that morning, Santa Anna launched his attack. Mexican troops led by General Manuel Maria Lombardini burst out of a broad ravine and charged against the U.S. line. Breaking through the U.S. position, the Mexican army took the offensive and swept east across the plain. Mexican soldiers advanced along the foot of the mountains and circled around the U.S. troops to seal off the road behind them. Instead, they met the Mississippi Rifles, led by Colonel Jefferson Davis. The regiment had linked up with another from Indiana to create an open-ended V formation. As the Mexican troops charged between the lines, the U.S. soldiers cut them down. Later that day, Santa Anna called up his reserves and ordered an all-out assault. But once again, the U.S. artillery proved its worth. Batteries tore into the Mexican troops with a deadly hail of canister and grape. And the Mexican attack stalled. As night fell, both sides were exhausted. Many went to sleep wondering how they could survive another day.
The evening of the 23rd must have been a pretty gloomy evening for Taylor sitting there at Buena Vista, because his troops were spent from the day's fighting. He knew that in spite of the fact that they had repulsed all of Santa Anna's attacks, he was still vastly outnumbered, and the reinforcements had not come up in any substantial numbers. He had every reason to feel that the next day was going to be a very, very tough day.
Early the next morning, the U.S. soldiers looked out over the battlefield. The Mexican army was gone.
They fell back to Agua Nueva, and Santana mentions in his battle report that he does this because the soldiers are exhausted. They have not eaten for 2 days. They had not been able to eat during the battle, nor have they had water. So he decides to return to Agua Nueva and plans, he says, to attack again in a few days. In fact, he does not.
For Santana, the triumph that had seemed so certain the day before had become a wasted opportunity. The field belonged to Zachary Taylor and his army of volunteers. It would be Taylor's last battle of the campaign, a victory that would make him a hero at home. Still, the U.S. casualties at Buena Vista were the highest of the war so far. 659 men dead or wounded. The Mexican army fared much worse, more than 1,600 casualties. The trail of wounded soldiers stretched all the way to Agua Nueva and beyond. As night fell, many faced a terrible fate.
Men abandoned in a desert, steeped in their own blood, shivering with cold, parched with thirst. On their faces the appalling calm of despair. In sight already were the coyotes and dogs who awaited the moment when they might begin their frightful banquet.
The first news to reach San Luis Potosí from the battlefield at La Angostura reported a Mexican victory. People rejoiced in the streets as cathedral bells announced special masses of thanksgiving. But when the remnants of Santana's battered army finally returned, the truth was easy to see. The march north had been disastrous, the trip back even worse. Half the soldiers that had started out just 6 weeks earlier were either dead, wounded, or missing. For Santa Anna, there was no time to rest. In Mexico City, a revolt had broken out against his vice president, Valentin Gómez Farías. Desperate for money to fight the war, Gómez Farías had tried to force the church to contribute more funds. In response, National Guard units, backed partly by the church, took to the streets in protest. Many of the rebel officers were from the upper class. The people called them polcos, after the polka, the dance then in fashion among the wealthy. For Mexico, the Polcos rebellion could not have come at a worse time.
La posibilidad de salvación.
The possibility of creating a united front among the different political groups in Mexico is gone. So now anything is possible. Obviously, what is in imminent danger is the very survival of the country as a nation. That's what's at stake.
Even as the government was falling apart, Mexico faced yet another crisis. Off the coast of Veracruz, General Winfield Scott was prepared to launch an invasion of the country. 10,000 soldiers anxiously eyed the coastline. It would be the first major amphibious landing ever attempted by U.S. armed forces. The operation was risky, the consequences of failure devastating, and Scott knew that the odds against him were overwhelming.
He had to land an army, establish a supply base, march 250 miles inland, seize the capital of a hostile nation, thereby bring about a peace, conquering a peace, not conquering a nation. Now that's a very, very tall order, and it was, as I said before, unprecedented practically in history.
In Veracruz, the commanding officer, General Juan Morales, appealed to Mexico City for reinforcements. But the government could not respond. The Polcos revolt had paralyzed the capital.
What madness had seized the Mexicans to provoke a civil war while a foreign enemy was lording over our cities and occupying our territory? Veracruz resigned herself to her fate.
On the morning of March 9th, 1847, the day dawned clear and calm. Scott decided the time had come. U.S. soldiers clambered over the rails of the transport ships into surf boats Scott had designed for the landing. Packed shoulder to shoulder, the men braced themselves for what they knew would be a terrible battle on the beach. At 5:30 in the afternoon, a gun sounded from Scott's flagship. The invasion began. Soon, the first U.S. soldiers scrambled through the surf and onto the beach. To their amazement, not a shot was fired. General Morales and his troops remained behind the thick fortified walls of Veracruz, hoping to hold out until help could arrive. For the next 12 days, Scott's troops surrounded the city with batteries of heavy guns and mortars. On March 22nd, Scott sent an ultimatum to General Morales. Morales refused to surrender. The following day, a battery of 6 heavy naval cannons replied with a volley of exploding shells that arched high into the air before raining down on the city. The guns had been placed by a 40-year-old Army engineer from Virginia named Robert E. Lee.
The shells thrown from our battery were constant and regular discharges, so beautiful in their flight and so destructive in their fall. It was awful. My heart bled for the inhabitants. The soldiers I did not care so much for, but it was terrible to think of the women and children.
The shelling continued day and night. Deadly fires broke out everywhere.
The surgical hospital in the convent of Santo Domingo suffered from the fire. During an operation on a wounded man, a shell extinguished the lights, and when other lights were brought, the patient was found torn in pieces, and many others dead and wounded. José María Castillo Velasco.
For 3 harrowing days and nights, U.S. guns poured an estimated 6,700 shells into the city. By the 4th day, priests no longer dared to venture out to minister to the dead and dying. Finally, the people could take no more. Veracruz surrendered. In Mexico City, the satirical press criticized the government and the military's inability to turn back the U.S. invasion. The capital was still reeling from the Polk's revolt. Once again, it was Santa Anna who was able to temporarily unite the country's divided leadership. The president promised to protect the church from its enemies in the government in exchange for a loan to help fund the war. The scholar and politician Jose Fernando Ramirez criticized the church's loan as too little and too late.
2 months before, with this sum of money, the clergy could have undoubtedly redeemed themselves. They could have saved Veracruz and our nation, and at the same time saved the 300,000 pesos which they used in a civil war. A war which is going to cost us very dearly.
Santa Anna now faced another, even more serious threat. General Winfield Scott and his army would soon be on the march toward the capital. On April 2nd, as crowds of well-wishers lined the streets, Santa Anna left Mexico City with 6,000 troops. Before his departure, he issued a public proclamation, words he hoped would finally unify the nation.
Mexicanos, Veracruz calls for vengeance. Follow me and wash out the stain of her dishonor. To our shame be it said, we ourselves have produced this deplorable misfortune by our interminable discords. Mexicanos, the national cause is infinitely just, although God appears to have abandoned us. The hour of sacrifice has sounded its approach. Your fate is the fate of the nation, not the Americanos, but you will decide her destiny.
In early April, Santa Anna arrived at his hacienda El Cerro. In the past, El Cerro had been Santa Anna's refuge from the world of politics and war. Now, it became his military headquarters. The estate was 70 miles up the national road from Veracruz, directly in the path of Scott's advancing army. Here, on his own ground, Santa Anna planned to meet the U.S. invasion and drive Scott's army back to the coast, where yellow fever would finish the job. Not far from his hacienda, in the rugged hills near the village of Cerro Gordo, Santa Anna positioned 12,000 troops. Mexican forces now blocked the road to Mexico City at a point where it cut between steep hills on one side and a ravine that tumbled into a river on the other.
It's on high ground, flanks well protected on the river on the right, and supposedly impassable terrain on the left. His selection of that piece of ground was, I believe, close to masterful.
The position was strong, but the troops were poorly deployed. Santana's officers warned that the enemy might try and circle around them. One of the general's most experienced engineers, Lieutenant Colonel Juan Cano, recommended placing artillery on a nearby hill called La Atalaya. Santana ridiculed the advice.
In almost all of the military operations that he conducts throughout his military career, one can see him imposing his will on others. It was also a product of this arrogance that drove him. I am the only one, the best. And this happens when people come under the influence of that terrible drug called power.
On April 14th, Winfield Scott reached the pass at Cerro Gordo. His troops numbered 8,500 against Santana's 12,000. Some of Scott's officers recommended a frontal assault. Instead, Scott looked for a way to do exactly what Colonel Juan Cano feared he would: circle around the Mexican forces and cut off the road behind them. But the ground was unfamiliar. Scott ordered one of his best engineers, Captain Robert E. Lee, to scout the area. At dawn the next day, Lee slipped quietly out of camp to find a path through the steep ravines.
In the course of his reconnaissance, Lee got so close to the Mexican lines that he all of a sudden got trapped there at one point. And he had to lie behind a log for hours while the Mexicans sat there on the same log he was hiding behind and chatted and drew their water and went back to, he was that close. We almost lost a good officer there, but the information he brought back as a result of that was extremely valuable.
Lee's drawings showed Scott that there was a way around the Mexican flank. That night, Scott ordered guns placed on the hill Santana had refused to fortify himself, La Atalaya. At 7 a.m., the U.S. battery on La Atalaya opened fire, taking the Mexican troops completely by surprise.
Our whole force, with a loud shout, leapt the breastwork and met the Mexicans at the point of the bayonet. Here, for just one short minute, ensued a kind of fighting I hope I never see again. It seemed like murder to see men running bayonets into each other's breasts.
By 10 a.m., the fighting was over. U.S. soldiers took more than 3,000 Mexican troops prisoner. 11 years earlier, Santana had been captured in Texas. Desperate to avoid falling into enemy hands again, he raced toward the safest place he could think of, his home, El Encierro. But U.S. cavalry fire forced him to change direction and run to wherever he could find a place to hide.
Santa Anna, the first chief of our nation and our army, a few hours before erect and proud, was now humbled and confused, seeking among the wretched a refuge to flee to.
U.S. soldiers found Santana's carriage and an artificial leg with its boot still attached. News of the discovery spread quickly to the United States, where miniature replicas of the leg became popular souvenirs. To General Scott, the U.S. victory seemed complete. Mexico, he wrote, no longer has an army.
Well, Cerro Gordo should have ended the war. If you'd had a nation that was less determined and a president who was less determined than Santa Anna, probably anybody in their right mind would have sued for peace then. The Mexican army was destroyed. The path was open to Mexico City.
Santana had suffered one of the worst defeats of his life. Still, he would not give up. Even as Scott's victory message was making its way to Washington, the Mexican general set about reorganizing the scattered remnants of his army.
He was capable of defying all of these incredible challenges. So he says, all right, I have to defend the Valley of Mexico, Mexico City. And he sets out. He sets out to do the impossible.
For Santa Anna, the disaster at Cerro Gordo was already nothing more than a memory. The defense of Mexico City would give him another chance to prove himself a soldier of the people. The war was far from over.
Dear Father, what could have possessed you to send me way off here? Your notions of military glory are altogether too exalted. There is no fun in cutting throats. I've tried it. I am obliged to Mother for her advice, but it's no use to read the Bible in the midst of swords and bayonets. Either I am, or that book is wrong. Anonymous letter published in Yankee Doodle.
As the war with Mexico dragged on, voices of protest began to appear in U.S. newspapers, pamphlets, and magazines. Most people still supported the war, but many had expected the fighting to be over within a few months. Now, with costs and casualties mounting, opposition politicians attacked the president, denouncing what they contemptuously called Mr. Polk's war. Polk fought back, questioning the patriotism of those who criticized him.
A more effectual means could not have been devised to encourage the enemy and protract the war than to advocate and adhere to their cause and thus give them aid and comfort.
Much of the opposition came from anti-slavery forces who believed that the war was part of a Southern scheme to expand slavery. Among those who opposed the president was the abolitionist leader and former slave, Frederick Douglass.
The determination of our slave-holding president to prosecute the war and the probability of his success in wringing from the people men and money to carry it on is made evident by the puny opposition arrayed against him. None seem willing to take their stand for peace at all risks.
Another outspoken critic of the war with Mexico was the then little-known Massachusetts writer, Henry David Thoreau. In an essay later called On Civil Disobedience, Thoreau challenged Americans to follow their conscience.
When a sixth of the population of a nation which has undertaken to be a refuge of liberty are slaves, and a whole country is overrun and conquered by our foreign army and subjected to military law, I think it is not too soon for honest men to rebel and revolutionize. This people must cease to hold slaves and to make war on Mexico.
But the protests of anti-war activists like Thoreau had little influence on the general public, and the embattled president now seemed more determined than ever.
I declared to the cabinet that no alternative was now left but the most energetic crushing movement of our arms upon Mexico. I would not only march to the city of Mexico, but I would pursue Santa Anna's army wherever it was and capture or destroy it.
Set beneath the twin volcanic peaks of Popocatépetl and Iztaccíhuatl, Puebla de Los Angeles, with 60,000 residents, was Mexico's second largest city. Located midway between Veracruz and the capital, Puebla was famous for its many beautiful churches. Now it found itself in the path of war. On May 15, 1847, the first U.S. troops arrived.
At 12 o'clock precisely, the vanguard of the invading army entered the south gate and marched to the grand plaza fronting the cathedral. They stacked their arms and supplied themselves with water from a fountain, a Carolina volunteer.
The streets were swarming with the multitude as far as the eye could reach. Our little army of 4,000 was completely lost in the crowds that pressed around us, examining us pretty much as they would the animals in a menagerie. Captain Kirby Smith.
With the occupation of Puebla in place, Scott took the time to rest and reorganize his troops. Some took advantage of the opportunity to walk the streets of the beautiful old city. Many a New England Congregationalist or Ohio Methodist was astonished by the opulence of a Poblana church. And at Cholula, just outside Puebla, U.S. soldiers marveled at the sight of a gigantic pyramid more than 1,000 years old. It was raised by the Toltec people to honor their god Quetzalcoatl. Later, the Spaniards built a Catholic church on top. Many of the soldiers had read about Cholula in a popular book called The Conquest of Mexico by William Prescott.
Many soldiers carried copies of the book with them. They used it as a kind of guidebook, and they wanted to visit all of the sites that Cortez had been identified with, that they'd read about in Prescott's book.
And when our flag has been upheld and crushed lies each presumer.
Inspired by their role in what they saw as a grand historical drama, U.S. soldiers picnicked atop Cholula and dreamed of glory.
To conquer the descendants of the Spanish conquerors and to plant the flag of our young republic upon the capital reared centuries ago above the ruins of Montezuma's palaces. What prospect more captivating to the youthful imagination?
But there were others, like Lieutenant John Peck, who looked ahead and saw that if glory came, it would come at a price.
Our force is small, not quite 10,000, with an inadequate siege train and small supply of ammunition. I am confident we cannot be beaten, but we must oppose great odds and decide by the bayonet.
In April of 1847, President James K. Polk made one of the most important decisions of the war. He would send a diplomat to travel with Winfield Scott's army. His name was Nicholas Trist. He was second in command at the State Department. He had served as U.S. consul in Cuba and was fluent in Spanish. Trist was also well connected in Washington. He was married to Thomas Jefferson's granddaughter and had worked closely with Presidents Andrew Jackson and James Madison. The diplomat's assignment was to accomplish what the invasion so far had been unable to achieve: successful negotiations with Mexico.
Unfortunately, he was a man with a very thin skin and a man of rather hot temper and a compulsive writer who wrote long dispatches and long letters in which he said many things that he should not have said.
On May 6, 1847, Nicholas Trist disembarked at Veracruz. Almost immediately, he managed to offend Winfield Scott. Trist sent a sealed peace proposal to Scott's headquarters, instructing Scott to pass it on to Mexican officials. But Trist did not bother to inform the general of the proposal's details, and Scott was incensed at the thought of being bypassed.
The Secretary of War proposes to degrade me by requiring that I, the commander of this army, shall defer to you, the chief clerk of the Department of State. The question of an armistice or no armistice is most peculiarly a military question appertaining of necessity to the commander of the invading forces. The safety of this army demands no less. General Winfield Scott.
Trist's reply took 6 days to compose and filled 30 pages.
The course determined upon by our government is what any man of plain common sense would take for granted that it must be. And it is not what your exuberant fancy and over-cultivated imagination would make.
If you dare to use this style of address again, or indulge yourself in a single discourteous phrase, I shall throw back the orders and instructions with the contempt and scorn which you merit at my hands.
For more than a month, Scott and Trist refused to speak to one another, and the peace proposal remained undelivered. Frustrated, Trist resorted to having a British diplomat pass the document to Santana. By now, Santana was in Mexico City, but he was in no position to respond to the proposal. The Mexican Congress had passed a law making it an act of treason for any official to negotiate with the United States. It was a measure aimed directly at Santana.
Santana was facing opposition from his own generals, and some of them were accusing him of selling out the country or being willing to sell out to the Americans. Considering Santana's past history, this was not an unreasonable supposition because Santana was always out for the main chance.
Esa es una situación muy curiosa, ¿no?
It was a curious situation, right? On the one hand, there was a fear of this important figure, Santana, who could declare himself dictator and with one sweep of the pen abolish Congress. But on the other hand, they knew that the only person who could pull all of the remaining forces together was Santana.
In Puebla, the private war between Nicholas Trist and Winfield Scott was coming to an end. In late June, Trist fell ill with dysentery, soon after sending Scott a conciliatory letter. The message satisfied Scott, who responded with a gift for the sick diplomat.
My dear sir, looking over my stores, I find a box of guava marmalade, which perhaps the physician may not consider improper to make part of the diet. Yours very truly, Winfield Scott.
When Trist recovered and the two men finally met, they discovered they liked one another and quickly became fast friends. But Scott now faced a serious crisis. His army's supply lines stretched 200 miles through the mountains to Veracruz. Wagon trains moving along the national road were under constant attack by bandits and guerrilla fighters. Scott's solution was both simple and daring. He would cut his supply lines to the coast. From this point on, his army would live off the land. The decision astonished an old acquaintance who had been following Scott's campaign from abroad, the Duke of Wellington, victor over Napoleon at Waterloo.
Scott is lost. He's been carried away by his successes. He can't take Mexico City, and he can't fall back on his bases. He won't leave Mexico without the permission of the Mexicans.
But for Scott, as for Cortez, who had burned his boats at Veracruz 300 years earlier, there would be no turning back. On August 5, 1847, he ordered his army to march on Mexico City.
I resolved no longer to depend on Veracruz, but to render my little army a self-sustaining machine. We had to throw away the scabbard and to advance with the naked blade in hand.
This documentary series has been made possible by grants from the following: the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and the annual financial support from viewers like you, the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, and the Meadows Foundation. Additional support has been provided by the Arthur Vining Davis Foundations, the Summerlee Foundation, and the following organizations and individuals.
This is History's Best on PBS.
As Mexican soldiers prepare to defend their capital city.
What frightens me is the future. I cannot even guess what will become of us. Tell my family that my heart is broken.
In the next episode, the U.S.-Mexican War concludes with the fate of nations.